Right, welcome back to the few of the 9 people in this class who are actually paying attention to the content that I am uploading for you all. So we are moving on to week 5 and our second cultural form, which is carnival. Without further ado, of course, it's something that we know quite a lot about, but we're going to go into a little bit of detail about the history and things like that today, and of course apply it to the syllabus objectives. So back to the syllabus objectives, the same would have applied, well, more or less the same would have applied for landship. So we're looking at the elements, physical and symbolic, all them things from number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7. So this is on pages 18 to 20 in your syllabus. Of course, looking at the cultural form itself, looking at how it relates to theatre, and so on and so on and so forth. So let's start off, of course, with a bit of the history of Carnival. So Carnival, let's define it first. Carnival is a season that lasts from roughly right after Christmas all the way up until Carnival Tuesday. But the high point of Carnival itself is Mass, which of course is short for masquerade. And of course, Mass happens on the Monday and Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. Well, in Trinidad, it happens on the Monday and Tuesday before Ash Wednesday each year. Our carnival happens at the same time as other Caribbean carnivals like Dominica, Haiti, and Panama. And then, of course, there are other countries who have theirs at different times throughout the year. Some of them actually used to have it at the same time as ours, but they had to move it because Trinidad Carnival is just so great that it was a force to be reckoned with. So basically, the tourist industry would have failed if they kept it at the same time as ours. One of those countries being St. Lucia. We have countries like Antigua and Jamaica that are now coming with carnivals. They have their own masquerade traditions like John Canoe, but they are now coming with carnivals that are similar to ours, mainly as a money-making venture, while ours is, and this is what a lot of people don't understand about Trinidad Carnival. It's not just jump up and wine for 2 days. Our carnival is much more than that. It's much longer than that. It's much deeper than that. And some countries, including the, in inverted commas, first world countries that have Caribbean carnivals, don't have that kind of sentiment attached to it. And we're going to go into a bit of the history and see why carnival is so important for Trinidad. So of course we have countries like Canada. They have a carnival. There are carnivals in several parts of the United States, several parts of England. There's carnival in Japan. There's carnival in Amsterdam, in Germany, all over the world. And a lot of these, if not all of them, are inspired by, so they're replicated Caribbean carnivals. So they would be by people from the Caribbean who live in these countries and just create their own Caribbean carnival wherever they live. Right, so let's go dive officially into how carnival started in Trinidad and Tobago. So in 1783, which was a very long time ago, the cedula population invited French people, rich French people, to come and live in Trinidad. So at this point in time, we were under Spanish rule, so we were a Spanish colony, and what the Spanish colony did is that they invited French people from France and neighboring islands like Martinique, Guadeloupe, even St. Lucia. So they invited them here once they promised to be loyal to Catholicism, to the Catholic religion, and they gave them incentives to come and live here. So they would give them land, they give them a place to stay and things like that. I am not exactly sure why. But yeah, so basically at this point in time, we had a lot of French people coming to Trinidad, and we experienced a shift in our population where a lot of, a high percentage of the population, and not just the general population, but the upper classes were made of French people. And of course, out of that, we had French last names coming in, people like Dubois and Etienne and all these French last names, French place names as well, like Avocat, Sanssouci, I think Coquillet might be French. Yeah. So basically we had a cultural shift coming in to Trinidad, and they brought two main traditions that mapped onto Carnival. One was they had a big feast right before Lent, because of course Lent is a period of fasting. So right before, they would have a huge feast, where they would enjoy all the things that they were not supposed to enjoy during Lent. So as carnival comes from the French word carnival. I should have put that in the slides, but I didn't. Carnival meaning farewell to flesh. So because one of the main things that people would have abstained from for Lent was meat, that Carnival Tuesday, which is Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, would have been when they would have had the big feast where they would have a whole lot of meat in excess. So the pre-Lenten parties would just be celebrations of excess and fun, right before the period of fasting. So that was one tradition, and the other tradition was masquerade balls. So they would have this all throughout the year, but basically these aristocrats, which is another word for rich people if you didn't know, would either dress up, so they would have huge ball gowns and masks and things like that, or they would dress down because they were so used to being, rich and fabulous, that sometimes they wanted to be ordinary. So they would actually dress as slaves. So there's a traditional character called the neg jardin, which is where the aristocrats used to dress as what they call the garden negro. So just a common black man. So they would either dress up or dress down. And these were two things that we kind of adopted from them. And what happened was that when they had these celebrations, the enslaved Africans were not allowed to attend. So they would have their own, in their own living spaces. They would observe the kinds of masquerades that the French would have, and they just replicated them with their own music, which would have been drumming and singing and dancing, their own costumes and things like that. So then slavery was abolished in 1838, and instead of these celebrations taking place in their living quarters, where they would have more or less had to hide to do them, they now took liberty to go out into the streets and celebrate the fact that after all these years of being oppressed by slavery, they were now able to live a bit freer than they were before. So these street celebrations were what started off as can brûler, which comes from the French word can brûler, meaning cane burning. And we're going to go a little bit into can brûler. So what can brûler was is that they reenacted times during slavery when if the cane fields set on fire, now sometimes it was accidental, but most times it was that some mischievous slave decided to set the fields on fire as a means of kind of acting out against this oppression under slavery. So when this happened during slavery, they would have to extinguish them. So what they would have to do in order not to waste the cane, because burning cane is part of harvesting anyway. So in order not to waste the cane, they would have to try to harvest as much of it as they could, as quickly as possible. So they actually just sort of made a party out of it. So they would sing and dance, and it would be all festivities because all of the slaves would come together and so on and so on. So that is how can brûler sort of turned into a celebration then. And after slavery was abolished, they would reenact these scenes and also celebrate. So that kind of became the lower class carnival, emerging out of slavery. So this is a quote by, where the name? Right, by this lady who wrote about it. So she was saying that even though they had to work very hard, they made a very festive event out of Canboulay. So it was kind of in smart. So they would kind of make a reason to party, as Caribbean people often do. Right. So the thing about Canboulay also was that now that they were free, now that they were no longer under a contract of slavery, they they wanted ways to lash out at these people who had kept them in captivity for so many years. So they did that through Carnival. So they would have celebrations that were deliberately lewd or deliberately scary, or things that they knew that the elite would not like. So they would do things like cover themselves in molasses, and that's how we have the traditional character now, the Jab Molassie. And they would literally whine and dance and sing and shout in ways to disturb the upper classes, who were very much concerned about being civilized and all these notions of etiquette and things like that. So they just did the exact opposite, to say, you know what, we are free now and we can do what we want, and we're going to do it in a way that's going to upset you. So after emancipation, of course, they had to move away from the plantations, and they moved into the cities, into these spaces called barrack yards, which are quite like the picture here. If you think about sea lots, it's where they all lived in very cramped spaces. So your wall would be your neighbor's wall. And these yards, because of course they're the same communities that were coming out of the plantations, and they shared this sort of hatred for the conditions that they lived under for the last however many years. I think it was about 300 years, or maybe less. I don't know. So they all had this shared sense of oppression and a shared sense of hatred, because even after emancipation, it wasn't as though one day they announced that slavery was abolished and all was well. For many years they were still oppressed after, and still continue to be oppressed now. So of course, living in these conditions, they sought ways to kind of just express their distaste, their hatred for the conditions that they lived under before. So these yards, these barrack yards, became a space now where they were able to perform this, to not just say it and complain and speak out and say, hey, look what they did to us for all these years, but they were actually able to perform it and make something creative out of it. Oh, right. So, oh, I didn't do my, okay, oh well, I didn't do my transition properly. So in these backyards where we had things like calypso, stick fighting, and jamet masks, not necessarily originating, but they originated during slavery, and then they were just developed in these yards. So the word jamet itself is one that's very important for us to understand in the development of Carnival, because the Jamets of the time were the people who started Carnival as we know it now. So the word Jamet has two meanings. Basically, the first one is coming from the French word. You see a lot of this is linked to the French culture. Diametre, meaning like a line. Basically, it's like almost a level, a marker showing the level of civility, of respectability, of humanness almost that people have. So they kind of flip the word to say that these people, the Jamets, are below that level. And also another meaning that comes out of it is that these practices, a lot of these barrack yards were located behind the bridge, as people call it, in Port of Spain, in East Port of Spain, which is basically bottom of the hill of Laventille. And in front of that bridge would have been where the upper classes were living. So basically, they're saying that the bridge was the diameter, was that level, and behind that was anything just uncivilized. And of course, there were very many racist overtones and undertones, because of course there was only black people situated in those areas. So in the barrack yards, the types of performances would have been things that, and they still persist in our traditional carnival representations today. So they would have been things that either mocked the upper classes. So if you think about the Dame Lorraine, which is supposed to mock the French woman who was so haughty and so full of themselves, they depict folklore characters. So all of these were in efforts to retain these cultures even outside of plantation life, or they would have reflected on the traumas of slavery. So, of course, as I was saying, they were things that were deliberately supposed to shock the onlooker, deliberately supposed to be distasteful because they were reflecting on how distasteful and shocking and horrible slavery was. So if you think about these blue devils and the fact that they scream and they're almost like monsters, supposed to represent like the white man in inverted commas as the monster, as the devil in their lives. So what happened was that each barrack yard would compete against each other in calypso and in stick fighting, and this led to a lot of violence usually. And the upper classes hated it. They hated this lower class carnival, not just because of the violence, but because, of course, it was intentionally designed to make them hate it as well. So by this time, now remember, before, the French elites would have been the people who were mainly involved in carnival, but by this time now that the Germans had taken over, they managed to get them out of it to a point where the French people or the middle and upper classes no longer wanted to participate in carnival at all, and that was just the perfect opportunity for them. They had their free space to roam and be themselves and offend the upper classes as much as they wanted. So this is a picture, a recent picture. You can see steel bands and traditional carnival characters. So this is literally the bridge in East Dry River, in Port of Spain. So behind that would be places like Piccadilly, John Laventille, places like that. So this is the hub where Carnival would have started. Right, so just to delve a little bit more into how deliberately offensive these things were. So obviously you're looking at the picture on the left hand side, you're probably quite familiar with the Jab Molassie. So literally Jab Molassies was so terrifying at a point in time. They would do things like eat raw meat, or they would have things that look like blood running down their faces. They would terrorize people looking on and things like that. And then the one on the right, you might not be very familiar with it, but it's called the pissenlit, which is basically French for bedwetter. So this particular character was one that was banned for a very long time. And what it was it was a person who dressed up as a house slave, basically, who would soil their clothes, who would basically, and that's why it's called bedwetter, who would either let their menstrual blood leak out, or who would defecate on themselves to deter the planter from raping them. So if you look closely, what she's holding there is a posy. So they would pretend and to do things like eat their own feces or drink their own period blood and things like that, because it was supposed to look disgusting, to just represent how disgusting slavery was and the kind of things that the slaves would have to go through to deter planters from raping them and things like that. So you could just think about how these things were very offensive, deliberately, to the upper classes at the time. And of course, there were other portrayals where the masks were used to hide their identity so that you wouldn't be able to identify, oh, it was this person doing this or doing that. Right. So it all came to a head in 1881 when there were the Canboulay riots. So as I said, the authorities really hated Canboulay, really hated the carnival that existed at the time. Um, and they came up with all sorts of excuses as to why it should not happen. They said that the flambeau would cause fires. They said it was too violent, all that jazz. And what happened was that the authorities and the masqueraders ended up in a big clash, and it ended up in a riot, with many people being injured. So then after this, because of course it was a big occurrence, they had the perfect opportunity to put laws against it. So they put laws that were banning masking, drumming, stick fighting, and large crowds. So at that point in time, people thought that this would be the death of Carnival, basically, because they put all these restrictions on it. But it did not turn out like that, because as a people, we are survivors. So we find ways to overcome limitations and overcome oppression. So we had things like, because they banned drumming, they would of course find other ways to make music. So they came up with tambu bamboo, which literally uses pieces of bamboo to make music out of it, or rhythm sections where you use things like an old car tire, bottle and spoon, pieces of old iron, to create instruments. And of course, most popularly, quite importantly, the steel pan, which was literally just an empty oil container that they would temper in order to make music out of it. So they said, okay, you're going to ban drumming. We are going to find other ways to make music. We're going to find other ways to make noise. So even under these laws, Carnival was still happening, but it was much tamer than before. And because stick fighting was not such a big part of it anymore, and of course stick fighting was thought to be very violent, they took more time to do things that would be less offensive then to the middle classes, so that they would not have any reason to confront them about anything. And at this time, the upper and middle classes thought, okay, maybe it isn't so bad after all, and they then became reintegrated into the carnival after a long time of being basically put out. They found a space as it was more tame, it was more pretty, it was less crude. So they kind of developed a parallel carnival, not necessarily that they entered the lower class carnival, but they felt that the streets and things were more safe for them to do their middle class things. So then as time passed and they realized that carnival was not much of a threat anymore because they were practicing it in a way that was not very offensive, the government then decided, instead of trying so hard to restrict it with laws, they would try to restrict it in other ways. So they just tried to basically make it a bit more pretty. So what they did is that they institutionalized it. They came up with competitions where they could regulate what kind of calypsos were being sung. The king and queen of the band, of course, because they're providing a monetary prize for costumes, people would be less inclined to make their Blue Devil costumes, or their costumes that were offensive or lewd or crude, and they would try to make something more artistic in inverted commas to win money. So these were their ways of controlling what was the priorities in Carnival then, in a smart way. So yes, as I said, the Jammets continued their own practices, while the middle classes then took on so their portrayals would have been things like gods of Egypt, biblical portrayals, fantasy things. So they would portray things like birds, and that is what kind of lent itself to the kind of tradition, the kind of contemporary mass that we have now, which is where it's not necessarily a portrayal of a character, but more of a theme or an idea. So basically what they did was that they made when I say they, I mean the upper and middle classes, they took Carnival and did what they wanted with it. So they created it into something that they could make money out of. So what happened at first was that you had merchants, people who owned shops, which was typically white or Syrian people, using bands to promote their businesses. So they discovered that they could make money off of Carnival by making people pay for costumes and things like that. When traditionally it was just a community affair where people would make their own costumes, they would have no cost except for whatever materials that they needed, and sometimes it was materials that they found and things like that. So instead, the middle classes took it, reclaimed it again now, and made what they wanted out of it. They made it pretty and they made it less offensive to themselves. And quite interestingly, after World War II, so that's when we had Americans occupying Trinidad because they came to stay in, because America was one of the countries in World War II. So there were many American soldiers here, soldiers and sailors, and their presence and the entire World War really changed a lot of perceptions about things. So the Americans were quite loose, so to speak. So things like and because there were a lot of men involved in the war, you saw that women came to basically the forefront of society. They took up all the managerial positions, they were in charge of the household, things like that. So you found that women had a lot more freedom to be public with their sexuality, because of that influence of the Americans. And after that, you saw a lot more women participating in Carnival, and a lot more women were willing to, and they felt more comfortable putting their bodies on display and things like that. So Carnival became very much about the body and about women, when before that it was actually things like Carnival, Calypso, stick fighting, all of these things were very much centered on men.